Who Archer Mayor is. He's has been or still is a firefighter, an EMT, a police officer, and an investigator for Vermont Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. He is also an editor, a researcher, and much, much more. So, and also, he is the author of 28, I believe, mysteries featuring Joe Gunther, who is his investigator, and it's based in Brattleboro. And his latest book is called Trace, and as you can see, there's a lot of Archer's books over here for sale tonight, and I'm sure he'd be glad to sign them for you. So, I guess, Archer, if you would come forward. Thank you very much for being here. I'm sure everyone's going to enjoy your presentation.
Great, that was it.
You want this?
No, I actually, I'm the youngest of 6 kids. If you can't hear me, there's a problem and it's not me, okay? I just want to make that clear. If I wasn't loud enough at the dining room table, I didn't get fed. Now, I obviously didn't get fed excessively, but I made do. So I hope, I've already talked to the cameraman, so he's used to the fact that I might move around. So, you know, we trained, we practiced, and you're good to go.
I have wide angle.
Okay. I did say, however, that I wasn't going to go running over there to do my talking, so I'll try to keep within normal range. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I can tell it's obviously a really dead night in town, but I appreciate it, you know, no kidding. Springfield is near and dear to my heart, to the point where I fictionally kill people here on a regular basis. I don't do that for every community. More to the point, one of my heroes lives here. Don't try to identify where he lives or burn him out if you don't like him in one story or another, because it is make-believe. I try to tell people that this is fiction when they start fogging my glasses with, you know, their personal irritations. So, you know, it was funny. When I began this career back in 1988, I figured that since I'm remarkably good looking and an astonishingly good writer, that it would take me about 5 years, and then I would contact Johnny Depp's realtor and put a dib on that island next to his, just to make his life miserable. You know, someone has to do it, so I was ready to volunteer. So here we are, all of us, 28 books later. Johnny Depp is fine. There may be or may not be an island next to his. I'm never going to find out. I guess what happened was that, no, I did not become a magical super duper bestseller. And I think the reason for that is that I sort of got seduced, very bad thing for someone in my business to do, by what I was doing. I fell in love with the stories. I yielded entirely to the characters. And I have evolved now to the point, all these decades later, to where I guess people are more real in my head than they are in this room. You know, writer as therapy. I always thought writers were very strange people. Now all I just have to do is look in a mirror and prove the point. So I work through issues, I examine things, I pick issues apart in my head. I sort of, all of us wonder, especially in moments of crisis, why in God's name did you do that? You know, but we don't ever say that because usually you don't want to get in trouble. But I get to say that because they're all make-believe, and so also I have Willie Kunkel. It allows me to do anything I want, really. I have a daughter. hesitate to say a middle-aged woman now living in Philadelphia, but her mother protests too loud. That doesn't mean you're getting older, for God's sake, you know. That doesn't apply to me either. I tell people between the drugs and the makeup, I feel as young as the day I graduated from high school. So the point being, though, that she asks me every once in a while if I'm still doing events like tonight. This, by the way, what you're attending, is called an author imitation. That's right. And she says, "Dad, you still doing those?" And I say, "Yeah, I'm still doing." They still ask you if you're really Joe Gunther, and I say, "Well, actually, that rarely comes up." But yeah, sometimes people ask me if I'm really Joe Gunther, and you could hear her sigh, because regardless of her age, this is a woman of the world, and she just, you know, the weight is on her shoulders, and she just went, "Am I the only one who knows you are really Willie Kunkel?" Busted, you know, from the mouths of babes. But I always wondered why I really did like him a lot. So I guess that reflects well on my own psyche that he appeals to me. I also had to ask myself as these characters grew in three-dimensionality as I went through one book after another. I now, by the way, officially call this an interminable series of books, just so you're prepared. My mother is 98. My father died at 99. You're stuck with me for a long time. Just sort of get used to it. Okay? But I began to sort of figure out, or have to figure out, since I can't do anything else for a living, you know, what makes these people tick, and why are some attractive to you readers, and especially why Willie Kunkel? I mean, my God, this is a guy that no one with a lick of common sense would spend more than 5 minutes in a room with, and yet everybody tells me they love Willie. And I had to wonder, why is that? And I finally came to the conclusion that Willie gets to say what all of us are thinking. Don't you wish you could be Willie, you know? And the other flip side of that is that, I don't know about you, but I've created in Joe Gunther what I think is just the most remarkably decent human being. And so that's sort of what I do. I get up and I look at the mirror, as I mentioned, and I say, today, by God, I'm going to break all the rules. I'm going to have a Joe Gunther day. I'm going to be upbeat and supportive and, you know, helpful and avuncular and thoughtful and a team player. And then about 5 minutes after I finish all that, I have my first Willie moment. It all goes downhill from there. So I think that's what I've probably done, is I've created this ideal in Joe that all by himself, he would be as boring as a plate of milk in the hot sun. I mean, just nothing to it. But he's surrounded by these remarkably, I hope, interesting and sometimes downright quirky, cranky, weird people, Willie being among them. And I think that's probably what we've done with this. And I say we because I work off the feedback of you guys, which brings up the following topic. I am not a natural-born entertainer of crowds. I know my mother would argue that point, but don't listen to her. So I'm here in a large part to listen to your questions, because I want to find out what you want to find out from me. Because otherwise I could go on and on about the banking in Czechoslovakia in 1843, of which I know a remarkable amount. Actually, you don't know that I know nothing about that, but I could hold sway on it because, hey, you know, the blind in the valley of the blind. But sparing us all that, at one point I will lapse into silence, maybe, you hope, and I will respond to your questions. So start thinking along those lines, because what I most enjoy about these get-togethers is the back and forth stuff. That's where it gets irreverent, insightful, and occasionally funny, unlike the dreary stuff you've been listening to so far. Trace, is the latest hardback. This is an advertisement. Because Trace is the expensive book, so you got to buy several copies or you don't get out of the room. So Trace actually turns over a little bit of a new leaf, reflecting the challenge I set myself fairly early on, that I would always try, at least, never to write the same book twice. I mean, the committee that wrote the Hardy books and Nancy Drew, they were said, that wins, that's a good formula, stick with it. A lot of people said of my first book, that's a great book, just keep doing that. Never did it again. So I will far sooner run the risk of failure than I will ever try to repeat myself, because I'm already stuck with my own writer's voice, these cast of characters, the state of Vermont, the fact that they're murder mysteries, all that stuff is already there. And that's hard enough to repeat book after book after book after book. So I sure as shooting don't want to sort of tiptoe into my previous plots. That just seems dreary as all get out. However, I had fallen into the same trap that all of you have. You look at movies, you look at TV, you read the books, my books, and what are you told? You're told about a bad guy and a crime, or two or three or whatever, depending on how bloodthirsty the writer is. And you watch either one or several or a whole squad of investigators busy themselves forever long it's required in solving this crime, right? Okay, not too many exceptions to that rule, is there? I'm here to tell you that one of the hats that I used to wear, I'm sort of semi-retired now, in that I can't figure out why I still have a badge, but I used to be a functioning cop. I did, investigations and ran around, carried a gun, put on an attitude. I did all the right stuff. And in that guise, I would handle, on a good day, on a lazy day, I would have 15 cases going simultaneously. And we all did. I mean, that was, and it was fine. It was workable because not everything is hot and on first base. So, some of this stuff needs to be percolated a little bit. So it occurred to me all of a sudden that I'm writing about 4 investigators, says he, holding up 5 fingers. And I was never a math whiz. That's a rumor. And these 4 investigators, therefore, would have 15 cases each. And if I were an honest relater of police procedurals in Vermont, that's the kind of book I should write. That, of course, would be my very last book, because you guys would read it and that would be the end of my career. So I thought I would compromise a little bit. Actually, I'd compromise a lot. And the end result is Trace, whereby you've got 3 investigators, do it right this time, and because one of them gets thrown out of town, Joe has to take care of Mom, so that takes care of Mom and Joe, and that leaves Willie and Sammy and Lester, the local. Amazing how I remember those names. As investigators. Each one of those has a separate case that she or he works in Trace. And when I first broached this notion to a friend of mine, her face lit up and she said, "Oh, that is so cool. And then they'll all come together at the end and you'll have a single bad guy." No, that's not how it ends. I will give you that much about the end of this book. Let it go. But that was my concession. So you have 3 completely separate cases by 3 not completely separate investigators, because they share a same squad room, and they just like we did on the job. You shoot ideas across each other's prows to figure, God, I just can't get through what is it? It's like working a crossword puzzle together. It's very handy. Plus, if things go bad, then you can blame the guy who gave you the advice. And it works, totally works. So that was the background to Trace, and that reflects a little bit about how I will try something new every time. And I also am stimulated by what I don't know. And there's a lot of science and whatnot that I don't know, and a lot of that is developing at such an incredible rate. There's DNA stuff and blood analysis and fingerprint analysis, and the bloody computers that are owning our lives now are extraordinarily helpful in finding out who the bad guy is, or at least in getting innocent people thrown in jail or whatever floats your boat. And I do a lot of digging in that area because I'm fascinated by this kind of stuff that's cooking in the backgrounds. Now, can anybody in Vermont afford any of that in law enforcement? Of course not. But that's why it's fiction, so all of a sudden, we get grants from heaven, and somebody ends up with the better mousetrap, and usually it's Beverly Hillstrom, the ace, a medical examiner. Of course, I work for the medical examiner's office also. I'm a death investigator for them, and I can absolutely guarantee you that you're never going to see us work at that level. Okay. We'll try, we'll do good work, but we won't do that work. I mean, Beverly Hillstrom, my God, she's a gift from God. And I'm not. So, all right, I've said I'd shut up. I said I'd go to questions. I am now officially going to questions. Why did you come here tonight? I know, it was actually for you. Yeah. But there you go, all right, someone has to sacrifice, stick their hand up. Yes, ma'am.
So you started writing in '88, but what made you decide to start writing?
Yes, yeah, it wasn't the attraction of excessive amounts of money. You're quite right. The average income of an American writer now, I think, is $12,000. It used to be 10 back when I began 30, 40 years ago. So we are upwardly mobile. But, I was employed at the University of Texas Press. I was a scholarly editor. I wore a tie. And I was in Austin, Texas, and I was sitting at a table, which may have been made out of wood, either that or it was really good fake stuff. And there were about 12 people sitting around the table. This was an editorial meeting, and we just come across this book. May have just as well have been entitled The Sociological Impact of Left-Handed Chimpanzees in Peru in 1843, with which you are familiar, I can tell. The author came from a very large family, so we were looking at a print run of, almost 18 copies. And so the calculators, which existed in those days, the big clunky things, came whipping out, especially from the head of marketing, and he sort of does the math. He says, yeah, we could do that. There'll be $437.46 per copy. And we'll probably break even if we sell all 18 copies. And there was a pause as we all considered that, And I'm beginning to look around the table going, and so then, especially the guy comes back, he says, well, but if we published 15,000 copies, we could cut it down to like, $30.17. And the director, who was famous for going into a sugar crash and eating a banana at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so that calculated when you asked for him for a favor, sugar high or sugar low. And we all nodded our heads and went, well, that sounds like the way to go. And I thought to myself back in 1978, I can probably be this dumb all by myself. So I quit. I mean, I really quit. I haven't worked for anyone ever again. You guys get W things, W2s, 9s, 4s, something, W something. It means you work. You are in society. You're helping to support our life. I don't do any of that. I work as a contractor. Even as a cop, I work as a contractor. I walk in. Let's say the state's attorney needs someone to clean up sort of their major crime problems and whatnot, which I did after I worked at the sex crimes unit, and you can only handle so much of that. And so I went into the state's attorney and I said, well, you probably need an investigator, and I know the state is taking care of that. They've wiped you all out. But I will work on an hourly basis. And it'll be expensive on an hourly basis, but there'll be no retirement, no benefits, no time off, no sick leave, no coverage whatsoever. Sold. You know, I mean, my God, what idiot would turn that down? So, turns out the state's attorney in Windham County is not an idiot. I have cast no aspersions, but I have no knowledge of your local guy. So that was sort of what I did. I launched forward to sort of get away from people who, as a group, tended to dumb down. Well, that was great and very noble of me, I thought, you know, very enhancing psychologically and spiritually, but it didn't raise a dime. So what do? Well, it turns out that about a couple of years earlier, as a scholarly editor, I'd actually found something on the campus of the University of Texas, and I introduced it to the aforementioned director, and I hit him at just the right banana time, because he said, oh yeah, sure, we can publish that. It ended up on the bestseller list for 6 months. Now, we're all nodding, saying, yeah, but wrong, bad idea. University presses are not on earth to make money. And guess what I had just committed the crime of doing? So I was put in a closet for quite a while there. Not allowed out, don't do that again. I was literally told by the director, walk away from that. And so what are you going to do? Well, you're going to write your first murder mystery in which the director is the first corpse. Right? So I had tried my hand. And when was the last time you wrote a book?
Never.
Well, exactly, me neither. So, it was 300 pages of typing, and I felt pretty cocky about that. I knew it was junk, but it was 300 pages of typing. Well, I don't know about you, but I went to high school too, and we were never asked to write 300 pages of anything. So I was pretty impressed, sent it off, and I got back a comment from an editor who said, this may be one of the worst books I've ever read. But you have a good voice. That's all I needed. Did I mention I'm the bottom of 6 kids? What's it take? Not much, so that was good. I wrote a second book, and I sent it off to the same hapless person who said, slightly better. And so it went. I've got a filing cabinet about yay deep, filled with absolutely unreadable manuscripts, and I keep them. If I ever had a house fire, that's what I would save first, because that reminds me of my humble writer's roots. So you may have never written a book before, but you could, in fact, get away with it. It's like practicing for philharmonic performances. You practice, and you live with the rejections, and you embrace the fact that of course you're going to stink when you start. It was like your very first bike ride. Bam, down you go. So I pulled up stakes, sort of retired from the world, 1980, and realized in about 2 weeks after I'd gone through my fortune that I probably had to do something other than write the great American novel. So I called up a woman in Texas who was very rich and somewhat vain, and at least, if not vain, very curious about her background. She was one of these little orphan Annies rolling in $40 million. So I liked the component parts, and I put a pitch to her that she, of course, needed a private historian. And guess who had a degree in being a private historian? Actually, I sort of really didn't have much of an idea what my degree was in. It had that big of an impact in college, but I remembered it now, and she hired me. So I began life as a self-employed historian, not a teacher. I never taught history, but I wandered around the United States, sometimes to such an extent that I almost forgot where I lived. living out of motels across America. I remember being in Gina, Louisiana once, throwing open the curtain and looking out at the parking lot and thinking to myself, oh my God, I forget where I am. But it turns out that was excellent because people across the United States have a deep prejudice that you probably have no idea about. They don't want to see historians on the weekend. It's true. I'm sorry to break it to you in this way. There's a 12-step program that will help you along the lines of recovery, but it starts here. So I found myself in Motel 6s across America, unemployed. Well, once again, my murderous impulses came to the fore, and I began to knock people off in fiction. And so for years, I began to circle around the idea of Joe Gunther. Now, this was a long journey because he wasn't even named Joe Gunther. The very first time I used Joe Gunther, I killed him. And I kept sending off these manuscripts to editors who would get more and more, either more and more worn down or more and more impressed by what was going on. I don't know which one won out, but the punchline was finally a realization on my side that if you write about what you know, where you live, your own backyard, the people you encounter on a daily basis, you might be a little bit better informed than if you just conjure everything up out of whole cloth. And I was writing about a town named Julesburg, Virginia. Does it exist? No. Have I ever been to Virginia at that point? No. You know, and on down the line. And I think the reason I was doing that is because writers have one common fear. And that is that people are going to read what you write and come to conclusions about you. But in fact, if you're a good writer, they don't even think about the writer. All of you guys are readers. All of you guys know what it's like to get lost in a story. The last person you think about is the writer. You think you're the writer. I mean, that has come alive in your head. This is the movie that you're projecting in your brain cells. So that's what I began to realize, is that I mattered less and less and less as my talents got better and better and better. So that's the practice. And it took me from, I guess 1975 is when I rolled off that first thing, using a typewriter, I'll have you know, up to 1988 when the first Joe Gunther came out, open season, title I never liked. And so for that period of time, that desert time, I was struggling to figure out how to do what I now do all the time. And in the midst of it were also history books. And the history books taught me organization, taught me about the values of a beginning, a middle, and an end, talked about timing, talked about discipline, because there's a lot of that. Let me tell you, I can now say from vast experience, writing is no fun. But it is amazingly enlightening and enriching, and it's a habit I can't break. I think at long last I've come to recognize that I may be doing what I should have always been doing, and I really enjoy it. But it's not fun, because all you're doing is molding and crafting and shaping and working and working and working. And to this day, when I write each book, they're like 300 pages long, I will edit each 300-page book approximately 20 times. And that'll be using editors, it'll be using myself, Margot, who's taking photographs in the back of all the backs of your heads. That's going to be a really curious photograph. Now, I see everyone, I know I would. So she's my primary editor and gives me the most amount of flack, and that is what helps the most. You don't want to give your manuscript when you write your novel, which of course you're going to do now, You don't want to give it to someone who say, "Well, that's really nice, dear." Don't give it to someone that is going to cook you dinner. Don't give it to someone with whom you're related, etc. Well, of course, I guess so. Yeah. Okay. Well, there are exceptions. Go for the people who are honest, who are not afraid to speak their mind, and who have your betterment in the forefront of their thoughts, because that's what's going to benefit you. What's going to benefit you is someone saying, "I had a problem with that. I can recognize when I've hit my stride. What I usually can't recognize is when I just stumbled and I've screwed up." And it's very helpful. So if ever you are given the task of giving anybody any advice, do I really look fat in this? Tell them they do. It's a little bit of an ouch, but from there things get better. And that's how I've benefited like crazy from the editing process. So long-winded response, because it's a long process. You just work it and work it and work it. Now, why do I write murder mysteries if that was a sort of a subtext?
That's kind of a given, isn't it? I mean, you're kind of in the field, so
Yeah,
you kind of write about what you're in the field for.
Yes and no. That's the funny thing is, because if I was asked a little earlier, what do I read? I never read detective fiction, ever. In fact, I don't read fiction much at all. I read history books, going back to Mama in effect. But it makes me too frustrated. I don't like, I'm too much into it. It's like sitting next to a cop watching a cop show on TV. Well, I can't do that. I forgot. Well, yeah, that's so illegal. No, you couldn't. It drives you crazy. You don't even want to be in the room with someone like that. And I'm the same way. I don't want to get close to work like that, because you're right. Death investigator, EMT, firefighter, cop. It just goes on and on and on. And it informs me.
Wouldn't you find yourself critiquing other detective book authors as well? Like, for accuracy?
Doing what with
Like,
them? I missed the
reading
word.
the book.
Oh, reading.
a detective
No,
book,
the
or
funny,
watching the
people
show.
think I don't know what happens to other writers, but this writer is never influenced or off-put by any other writer's works. Some people say, no, I simply don't. I mean, I'm a historian. I will not read history books while I'm writing history books because their voices get in my way and they sort of spoil my game. That's never happened to me. As a writer of fiction, as a writer of murder mysteries, if I had that appetite, and in the early days I did, because I came out of reading that kind of stuff and I finally just overdosed on it. For all the reasons I rattled off. But at that transition, their voices, their writers' voices never fouled me up. I never felt that my voice was influenced, threatened, or somehow subsumed by theirs.
Oh, okay.
So that was never, I think some people run that up the flagpole, but that's never been my problem. It all comes from inside, so why would my recreational reading, or even if I'm reading someone that I respect, maybe I see something I like, I'll steal it. But I'm not troubled by it, nor does it influence me, because I can't pretend to be you. I mean, you can't do that. You will always fall back to your own inner habits as a writer. In fact, that's kind of your curse. Because you got to run riot on that. And that's where all the editing comes in very handy, is because they will say, you're showing that twitch again, you're using your favorite word, and it could be something like albeit, a real show-off word, typical of me, and I bury that in. Well, you can use one albeit in 300 pages, but you better not use it 5 times. And that's typical of what I'll do, because I lead a life that's driven by a pager. So I might be writing at 3 in the morning, I might be writing at 3 in the afternoon. I don't know when I'm going to be writing my books. And therefore, they're all sort of fragmented and mosaic-like in their construction, and it's not the way you would read, maybe, smoothly from beginning to end. Mine is much more broken up, and you lose your pacing, and you forget that you've used, albeit 5 times already. And so your editors are going to be incredibly useful on that task. Yes?
2 things. 1, where do you get your inspiration? And 2, do you have more than one book going or in your head at a time?
I try not to, just because that would screw me up. Yeah. So he grabbed the sword. No, it wasn't a sword, it was a knife. No. I sort of, the funny thing is that having dedicated myself to running away from the workplace, I have got the most stolid job in the history of job descriptions. For 39 years now, I've been writing. And I just crank out book after book after book. And lately, says he, 30 books later of Joe Gunther, I always submit a book at the same time of the year. I always start a book at roughly the same time of the year. I set this pattern for myself. It's a year schedule, not a daily schedule because of the pager, but nevertheless, it's pretty regular stuff. And therefore, 1 year, 1 book. And now the inspiration, that's an odd one. The inspiration usually comes from ignorance. I write about what I don't know. And so someone sends me an email, a scientist friend of mine, and says, do you realize this whole DNA stuff, what do you get out of DNA? And I said, well, you get gender and you get, of course, the profile. And he says, oh, no, you can get a lot more. That's what the courts allow in front of the judge. But do you have any idea what other kind of profiles you can get out of DNA? Hair color, eye color, skin color, even the shape of your body, tall, short, amazing number. Now, the percentages are not 99.9. They may be 65, they may be 83, they may, whatever they are. But as an investigative tool, not a probative tool, you can't take it into court, but as an investigative tool, think of what all of a sudden that little drop of whatever DNA, whether it's a scraping of skin or a drop of blood, all of a sudden that becomes a symphony of information. And we knew nothing about it. I didn't know nothing about it. But my friend Wally, the super scientist at Brookhaven National Laboratory on Long Island, drops me an email. Why? Because I've got a really weird Rolodex. So he calls me up and he says, hey, you haven't lived until you come on down and watch us do our magic. And I go down there and I immediately go, oh, that is just such a book. Now, am I writing about anything that I know? Negatory. So I don't do a plot. I don't do an outline. I have no ghost of. I'm on chapter 3 of book 30 right now. Number 28 is in the pipeline. So the book of 2 years from now, I'm writing it. Do I have even the ghost of a notion where I'm going? No. But I'm writing it. And I will be rewriting it and rewriting and rewriting it as I figure out what in God's name I've done. So that's sort of what happens. And as I go forward, typical case in point, I find out this guy in Brattleboro. Well, he turns out he's a super duper computer cruncher and he works for the defense. Now here I am writing about cops. I have a very good friend of mine who crunches computers and cell phones. And in fact, one of the reasons I got out of the business was that everything was going down to these bloody cell phones. I don't like cell phones. So I decided, you know what, I'm getting too old and I just can't grasp all this electronic stuff that everyone's doing now. So I just sort of faded away. But those were featuring in almost every criminal investigation I was conducting. So I was bringing in people who know a lot more than I do and using them. That's why we get that crosstalk stuff I was alluding to. But the point being that, oh my God, I lost my point. Where was I headed with that?
The guy in Brattleboro.
Guy in Brattleboro. There's got to be something you can give her. First dibs at the cookies afterwards. Okay? Right. Yes. Brilliant. God, it was almost like a test. You'd pass. Usually it's dead silence. You know? The guy in Brattleboro represents not the guys I pulled on. He represents the people working for the defense. So, you know, poor Joe, Dwayne, Roger, Frank, whatever, gets busted for doing something stupid. We call those dumicides when they're involved in. And he goes into the slammer, and of course, you know, he doesn't have any money, and he can't pay for Melvin Belli or some fancy lawyer to represent him, so he gets whatever he gets. Well, every once in a while, he also gets lucky because somebody will get hold of this guy and say, well, you know, how can you make me look a little better? Because the cops, they've got the prosecutors, they've got the investigators, they got everybody on their side. They got the state's attorney, they got the science guys, they got the crime lab, the medical examiner, and I got nothing. Well, his lawyer can now hire this fellow, and now they've got someone crunching the numbers. Well, I've never given that any thought whatsoever, because I was on the other side. You know, we're all hunters, you know, popping old Frank, Dwayne, whatever, from a distance. Now I'm thinking in my head, hey, I know nothing about that. Maybe I should play around a little bit on the defense side in a cop book and find out how that works, how the dynamics are. So I began to start interviewing private eyes. There are actually quite a few private eyes all over Vermont. Who knew? And they're doing really interesting work. And a lot of it has to do with what they call defendant mitigation, which is to take a defendant, and of course now he's been arrested and he's been thrown in the hoosegow, and everyone just has one view of him, which is all from the prosecution and the cops. Oh, the guy's a dirtbag, you know, the famous phrase. Well, the dirtbag's a three-dimensional human being, and he's got a sob story too, and he's going, who's talking for me? Well, the private eye might well hire this guy who crunches the computers and start putting together a little bit of a counter-argument. Well, I want to put that in the book. Where? I don't know. How? I don't know. But I'll do it because it's kind of cool. It's kind of interesting. So that's how I know. That's how I go about, you know, sort of building these things. It's kind of like building without plans, or God knows you sure as hell don't want me as your architect. Who else? Yes.
A lot of your characters have names that I recognize. Do you know these people, or do you just pick them out of the book?
All right, well, this is a little sly on my part. Okay, a lot of years ago, someone approached me, as they tend to, and they say, hey, you wrote yet another hardback, would you put it in our auction? And I was thinking, you know, it's a $20 or $25 hardback, and what are you going to get at your auction? You know, maybe you'll get 25 bucks or maybe not. But it's not going to generate a whole heck of a lot of money. And I thought there must be a better way for me to help raise money for this cause, whatever it is. And so I suggested once, and I just stole this from some other writer, but that writer made a big flippin' deal out of it, and I didn't. I just said, why don't we auction off a name? You can be a character in a Joe Gunther book. And they went, oh, that's random. And thank God, from the get-go, I thought to add, but I get to do anything I want with that name. So that's what I've been doing. And I think I overdid it on one book because over the span of a year, I got 18 separate auction winners. And I begin to sort of cut back a little bit. So, but there's rarely a book that doesn't have at least 8. And they're for whatever, hospitals and you know, lost puppy societies and Lord knows what, you know.
They're so different from the real person.
Oh, they have nothing to do with them. That's the new, as time went on, one dreadful dinner too many, I might add, I said, you know what, I don't want to meet you. I just want your name. And people were really great about it. You know, they just, sure away, that's good, it works for me. Oh, I can't believe you made me into such a character. So I don't meet them, I don't know them, I never even talk to them. It all comes by email, some name appears, and in it goes. It's now sort of a habit I can't break. Grace Cottage Hospital, the Vermont Preservation Trust, people like that, every year they just have a winner, and I don't think anything about it. I just plug them in. And the only way I keep track of them, I put a little asterisk by their name to make sure that I use them, because I hate that phone call. It's like, well, I won 3 years ago, and so we don't do that anymore. So I absolutely make sure to kill them. Or something, and it's but it is disturbing if you're a reader and you've done what I encouraged you to do, which is to start this fictional movie in your head and you're having a great time and it's all so magical and mystical, and all of a sudden you run across Bert. You go, that's not Bert. I know Bert, and it screws it up. But hey, so what?
Also, I'm mad at you for killing off Lynn.
Good. Made you care, didn't I? Yeah. That was a perfect case in point. So here I'm, we won't identify who Lynn is because not everyone knows who you're talking about, but...
I just wanted to let you
But,
know.
no, that's fine. Stand in line. You're behind people like my mother, so, it's a tough line to stand in. But there's a case in point where I'm feverishly working. This is sort of late in the book. You'd think I knew what I was doing. I get to the point where this guy with a rifle is pointing at this particular individual, or not. There are actually several targets. And I'm writing. I don't know really what I'm going to do. I haven't planned it out in the least. This was not some sort of Machiavellian idea on my part. So literally until I wrote the sentence that sent the bullet out, I didn't know who was going to get hit. And when I wrote it, I stopped for a moment and I went, oh, yeah. And that, of course, is crucial, because the uh-oh has got to go visit every other character in the book.
Yes.
And that's a feeling that I need to embrace and feel personally. So in a funny way, I feel your loss. I had high hopes for this. But as a medical examiner, I stopped counting at 700 dead bodies. I go out a lot. I've had 40 since January 1st. Okay? I see this a lot. And what I'm referring to is loss. Because obviously I'm not there for the bad guy, a dead guy. The dead guy's dead. But all the people alive, those who want to figure out what happened, but also those who know what happened and they're grieving. I have to be there for them too, and to help them through this process as best I can. So I take that home, not the real case, but that sense of loss, the feeling. I visit people in crisis, and I write about people in crisis. I don't need or want to or will ever take a real case and put it in a book. That would be rude and also unethical. But I'd be an idiot if I didn't benefit from all the stuff, the rescues, the fires, the rapes, the murders, the deaths, the loss. I see that stuff every week, nonstop, year after year after year. And I brought it to bear on that moment that you're referring to.
Will you ever do that again?
Oh, I have. I've done it before, and I've done it in one of the very, very first books. There was one of the detectives working when the books were all placed in Brattleboro, and it wasn't the Vermont Bureau of Investigation, it was the Brattleboro PD. There was a guy named Dennis DeFlorio And I sort of liked Dennis, and Dennis was a cool guy, but he wasn't gelling, and that was the problem. I only knock off people who are just not, so I probably won't knock off Willie or Joe ever, because they're too good. But there were problems in Paradise in my dark head, and so Dennis doesn't survive a book very early on. And so just before they lock up the coffin, I have Willie Kunkel put a donut on his chest. But no one notices. So I've done this to a greater or lesser extent throughout the whole series of books, just as I have in somewhat less sanguinary terms where, I say, Joe and Gail. Joe and Gail were supposed to be the perfect couple. I sort of visualized Nick and Nora Charles in my head. But it wasn't to be, because as the books progressed, and after what happened to Gail and the sexual assault in Fruits of the Poisonous Tree, she changed. That's realistic. I know my stuff there. And so the relationship fell apart. A death, if you will. She's still alive, but nevertheless the relationship came in. Did I plan that? No. But it happened, and so go the series. So I never really know, even on that fundamental level, what might happen. I wish them well, But just because they're make believe, and just because I may wish that, doesn't mean it's going to be always so. I had no malice for Lynn, but she's dead now. Yes. Well, I was in 1979, 80, and about that spot. I was unemployed, broke, had no plans, and in a fairly, sort of hopeless situation when it comes to feeding myself. So Vermont was a natural. And as soon as I came into the state, I was immediately embraced. Went, oh, well, that's no problem. You'll just do 3 jobs like all of us. And you'll call it making ends meet, whether they do or not. It was an amazingly natural fit. I'm not a native, but this is the only place I've ever been able to call home. And I think in homage to that is another reason I write this series of books. Because Vermont, is dismissed as outsiders might choose to make it. I find it just so enriching and informative and available for my kind of work. I played with the idea of, I could write about anywhere, because I'm now professionally unemployed, so the world is my oyster. But if I looked at Vermont, I realized, hey, there are only 25 people in the state. One of them is the governor, and the other guy's under the bridge, selling something. And I could probably get a fairly quick handle on how they all interact and work, and if I do my homework and spend enough time in their presence, I might be able to start to make an interesting, call it a sociological or anthropological study of a state. So I don't really want to write about good guys, bad guys, car chases. I'll throw that in because I want to sell books, and let's face it, they're fun. And let's face it again, they're all over the newspaper every day. I don't just make up these dead bodies I spend times with, life is tough. But below that quote unquote fun stuff, there we are, we human beings that sometimes have remarkably quirky problem solving gifts. And if I can spend time spelunking in our midst and figuring out what makes us tick or not, then that might result in an interesting body of work. And so that's really what I set out to do, and that's why when people say, oh, for God's sake, Mayor, you can't, everything gets more expensive, everybody else gets paid more money, and you're just chugging along at the same level, making ends meet, and driving a wreck of a pickup truck. Why don't you, with your abilities, talents, all that, so you got a New York agent, all this fancy stuff, you should write sex-charged, fast-moving, helicopter-filled thrillers and make yourself $1 million. And, I just sort of think, nah, I like this. You guys are feeding me. And I hope in return I'm feeding that back in a different form that you find interesting and entertaining and, more importantly, useful or worthwhile. So it's kind of a contract, and I'm comfortable with it. And hell, there's always Social Security. Well, maybe not always, but hope springs eternal. Who else, or are we run out of gas? I don't want to overstay my welcome. I have no idea when I'm supposed to disappear. Yes?
How do you choose your titles? Because you said you didn't like
Oh,
the first one.
yeah, I know. No, I had the perfect title for the first one, but another book was coming out a month before my book in 1988 with the same title. So the editor calls me up and says, you can't do that. And I went, oh, damn. Okay, so I came up with another title, and he went, no, I don't like that. This is not the kind of conversation I've ever had again. Well, you should never say never, but I rarely ever have with an editor. Because editors aren't writers, they're editors. And I don't fault them for that. I used to be an editor myself. But when you ask them to start getting creative, that's usually like someone saying, Captain, I think there's an iceberg ahead. So I probably gave him 20, 30 titles. He rejected every single one of them. And so I finally put the onus on him, and I just said, come up with a title, and we'll leave it alone. So he came up with Open Season. I hated it, and I left it alone. And the reason I hate it is not because in and of itself it's a bad title, but it's a cliche, and it represents unmitigated mayhem. Open season. That's what we're talking about. Well, open season is like, a guy with a machine gun in a closed room. The whole book is about very surgical mayhem. The bad guy in that book is very precise and absolutely not a man with a machine gun in a crowded room. So there was nothing open season about the contents of the book, and that bothered me. So, titles. Sometimes a title just comes to me. I like it. I might keep it for a couple of years. Fruits of the Poisonous Tree, perfect example. I'm talking to a colleague, a cop, and he uses the phrase, and I all of a sudden go, why didn't I think of that? But it's in the back of my head. I'm already writing a book. It already has a title. I'm not too worried about it. But eventually the book comes around, and I slip that title in. We had an experience just the other night. We're watching a World War II movie on Netflix, and someone refers, there's a night scene, and the couple is sitting under a tree or something, and they look out, and there's this bright moon, just a humdinger of a moon. Well, this is 1940, and the guy turns to the young lady and says, oh, it's a bomber's moon. Because the phrase "a bomber's moon" is the ultimate in equivocations. Have you ever heard that phrase before, a bomber's moon? A bomber's moon actually came out of World War II, so it was a funny superposition. And in the days before all this electronic wizardry and whatnot, and of course in a war in which bombers played a role by the thousands, a bright moon was a good way to see where the hell you were, and unfortunately where you were going to bomb, because you didn't have all the gimcrackery. You had windows. You went, oh, okay, I think I'll bomb the hell out of that place. And you can't see it if there's not a bright moon. But guess what can also see you in a bright moon? So talk about the king of ambivalent blessings. So a bomber's moon, for me, has a loaded extra meaning that I really appreciate. So whether will keep that title or not, I don't know. First, I put it in at the top of the manuscript, and I live with it for a few months, and I see whether I like it or not. Next year's book, this coming fall's book, is a tricky title. It's called Bury the Lead. Has anyone ever heard that phrase? Sir, okay. So you know what it means, okay? Paper term, newspaper term. And I'm an old newspaper writer, so I really appreciate it. If you know what you're doing as a reporter, you state what the article is going to be in a succinct form in the first paragraph, possibly the first sentence, so that the reader immediately knows, okay, got the headline, got the lead, and now I'm going to get the explanation. That's proper newspaper etiquette 101. Rarely practiced nowadays, but that's the idea. And if it's not practiced, then that's called burying the lead. So in paragraph third or fourth or whatnot, all of a sudden you come across the real punchline, the real point of the article. You go, oh, for God's sake. And the phrase has come up. Well, I was burying the lead. L-E-D-E. Yes, well, now this was the controversy, okay? So I'm a nerd, so I went into my research mode and called on a lot of people to look into this. As you correctly surmise, the roots of this phrase, lead, is spelled L-E-D-E. But if I wrote a book called Bury the Letty, those people are going to go, what the hell is he talking about? L-E-A-D, on the other hand, that's okay, except if I don't read it out loud to you, and you know that I'm a writer of murder mysteries, how are you going to pronounce lead? Now, is that an entirely bad thing, given my love of double meanings? So I looked at that, and we talked a lot about it, and we kicked it around. And now, do I adore the title? No, I don't adore the title. There are some titles I just love. And this one works for me. So we decided, editors and Margot and me, and we all sort of talked about it, kicked it around, and went, you know, I can't come up with anything better. And I still kind of like the aspect, and I know. So in the acknowledgments, I wrote an extra sentence explaining what burying the lead means.
But isn't that a triple meaning? Because in an investigation, you can have leads, and so.
Now you're on board, see? God forbid you're thinking like I do. So that's exactly where I want you to go. And that enriches the whole thing. And that's where I want you to read these books from beginning to end. Now, if brain candy is your thing, knock your socks off. You could just go through it in a single evening at speed reading. I mean, I have the first signing of the year. The book is still dripping wet ink. They go, oh, I loved it, I read it last night. When are you going to write the next one? So you could have given me, 260 days, but so I understand that, and that's fine, and I'll write for those guys too. But I far more appreciate those who slow down a little bit and occasionally stumble across a turn of phrase, a paragraph, a sentence that actually elegantly interrupts that dream that I'm trying to get going in your head with a little side comment on your parts that goes, wow, that was well written. I don't mind that one bit. And I will strive for that because I work a lot with the sound of language. I write, dare I say, musically. I can't play a musical instrument to save my life, but I look at language usage. It's a terrific language. It's got so much available. And to pick and choose and occasionally pay attention to that that cadence and that sound that attaches itself to well-used language, that's kind of neat. And you can still go, okay, he walked in that door and he walked across and he left through that door. You can still say that, but if you can say it in such a way that the reader goes, then that's an extra thing, just like the meanings in a complicated and somewhat bizarre title. So on go the titles, yes.
I just was wondering, all the 700 bodies, you got me curious now what area that covers.
My house. You don't want to come by my house. Trust me on that. No, I cover, here's a little primer on the, what we call the OCME. That's the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. There are 2 pathologists who work in Burlington. I'll do this really quick. And they can't go everywhere and do everything because they're too busy finding out what made us tick before we stop ticking. So they stay put and we send them cases. We are about 50 investigators, pretty much like me, and you get paid, as they used to say in the old days, by piecework. And of course, I've always told my office on a really good week, haven't you figured out yet that I'm creating the business? So, how dumb are you guys, you know? They all have my fingerprints all over them. In my world, I go, in my team, we cover all of Windham County and the bottom half of Windsor. So I'm up here a lot. I go to the hospital and I work with a PD in Springfield routinely. I go all the way up to Windsor. That's my uppermost sort of patch. So it's the whole southeast rectangle of the state of Vermont. So that's the 700 bodies.
In just 1 year?
No. In a year, you'll do anywhere from, well, to this year's been horrendous. Drugs have just changed all the numbers. So I'm already, I mean, there were years where I would do 40 for the year and I'm at 40 right now. So it's going to be a grim year, yeah.
So, don't get me wrong, I love murder mysteries. But going back to your detectives with 15 cases each, not every case is going to be a murder.
Right.
So have you ever considered doing, an investigation where it's not a murder?
Yes.
Yeah.
I've done a whole book. Fruits of the Poisonous Tree, there's not a dead body in
I
it.
haven't read that one yet.
That's all about sexual assault. I consider rape to be murder, but the victim stands and talks to you and adds to the emotional confrontation of the whole thing. So that's the murder mystery without a dead body per se. So yeah, absolutely. And of course these guys, they will be involved in other things, and I make allusion to that. By the same token, I also understand, you're reading and I'm writing about a make-believe world, and they're called murder mysteries. So, but quite honestly, I have gotten 3/4 way through a book before I realized I'd forgotten to kill anybody. So.
It's kind of the Cabot Cove syndrome, right? Where everybody in Cabot Cove dies.
No, I really, can you imagine being a realtor at Cabot Cove? Only 3 got killed here. That's all cleaned up. That was one of the reasons I left I had the team no longer be Brattleboro cops. I didn't want Brattleboro they could care less. Brattleboro, they're happy with anything that reflects on them. Well, that's a quote. What else am I going to say, right? But they're perfectly good with it. But I wasn't. I actually called it the Cabot Cove syndrome. So I just I needed to spread the wealth a little bit, and it also allowed me to not have to explain why a Brattleboro cop would be going up to Quechee or Burlington or even parts of Field. I mean, the second book is all in the Northeast Kingdom. The third book is in Chicago 50% of the time. So it's a little easier to have this make-believe major crime squad, so now we don't have to worry about purse lifting anymore. And that's all they do, and they're statewide. And so if they leave town, or if they leave the state, it's not as quizzical a challenge as Joe Gunther, Brattleboro police officer. I mean, if I had been his boss in the old days, I would have fired him, you know. So I would have terminated the series big time. So where are we at? Sir?
You ever get writer's block?
No, I don't have time for writer's block. I might take a nap. You know, so I get 10-minute writer's blocks and a good sleep, but that's it. Now, writer's block, and this is going to sound harsh to anyone who's experienced it, because obviously it's an entirely personal thing. You block for whatever reasons you block. But for me, writer's block would be a self-indulgence. You just snap out of it. You're having a bad writing day, either don't write or write badly and edit it later. Get something out. I mean, I might have a day where I write half a page. I might have a day where I write 10 pages. As long as I'm writing something, I've kept the ball rolling however lumpily. But if I all of a sudden go, I don't have it, you know, and then you develop that into, I'm blocked. Well, what the hell's that? I mean, you don't have the brains to get out of your own block? I'm too much of a pragmatist. I just don't. I mean, my father's a Yankee, you know, woodworker type mentality. My brother, my son, and everyone in our family carry knives. You know, gave to me at birth. So it was one of the New England rules. You know, got to be good with a knife, a handy knife. Never mind. With that kind of outlook, you're a problem solver, and writer's block doesn't correspond with that. So no, I've never had that. Yes.
I really like the way you use actual places from time to time in your books.
Yeah.
I grew up in Glover, so it blew me away when one of your books is in the Bread and Puppet
Yeah.
Museum.
Yeah.
Do you remember?
The skeleton's knee.
Thank you.
I can't believe I did that. You get your $5 later.
Okay. I didn't know if you'd be able to just pull that out like that. That's great.
I know. Me neither.
Maybe clarify something else for me. It freaked me out when they were landing at an airport in Wheelock.
Yeah. Well, it is
Now,
fiction. And every once in a while, I'm going to pull a rabbit out of the hat. You know?
Well, I thought it was possible Lyndon
Yeah.
Mills, which would be up on footing, you know, might be in Wheelock, but Wheelock's even dinkier than Glover.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No. That's where I'm going to snap you out of your daydream. But you know, I'm in an airplane and I got to land somewhere. Well, by God, you just got yourself an airport. It's a 10-minute wonder, just long enough to land. But then, yeah. No, I have people, you know, I've actually had people pulled over in Brattleboro by the cops for erratic driving, and they got a book in their lap. They're trying to figure out where the hell I killed that last, you know. But he said it was a red house, and the cops are just going. And no, Joe Gunther's not on duty. They're always coming by the PD doing that too. It drives them nuts. But yeah, so yeah, beware.
Oh, and I would like to thank you for your timing of your releases.
Yeah, curious, isn't it?
So I
Okay.
make it on my Christmas list.
I know. So here's Flatlander reality versus our own. Okay, prepare for this because this is truly comical. So, like you said, comes out pre-Christmas every year. Well, early on in this career, one of the New York editors calls up and says, "You know, we're gonna change that, and we're gonna release it around this time of year. You know, March, April, something like that." And I went, "Why?" And they said, "Well, everything gets published in Christmas, it's too much of a traffic jam, and we think it's affecting sales. And I said, you want something to affect sales? Sell my book during mud season. There's dead silence. Why? Well, they did it once. It turns out nobody in this room buys a celebratory gift during mud season. We went right back to Christmas, so point noted, I will quote you to the boss. How are we doing? I may have run out of gas. I thank you very much for a wonderful evening. Thank you for coming.